Howdy everyone. So the next step on the instructions is to install the manual trim cable, which for me personally, for many reasons, I am not going to do that at the moment. So I'm going to skip down here to the fitting of the vertical stabilizer. So the first thing that they have you do is to find this offset plate, and it literally says temporary clamp the 781 attached plate to the forward spar or the horizontal stabilizer. That's it. That's the only instructions you get for that plate right off the bat. And then you're supposed to trim the front spar of the vertical if you have not done that already, and then you clamp the vertical in place. So when you look at the plans, you'll note that here is that offset piece. This is the 781, this offset plate here. When you look at this, there's a dimension here of 3/8. From the bottom edge of the plate to the center line of these two mounting holes is 3/8 of an inch. Well, if you go over and look at your horizontal stabilizer, you will note that there are already two pre-drilled holes on the aluminum angle. There are two here and there are two at the top. However, they are not drilled through these reinforcement plates and the spar. So you'll have to come in here with a drill somehow and drill through this piece on all four holes. And they do make a note, I believe. Yeah, they have a note here that specifically says you use the horizontal stabilizer as a drill guide to drill through the 781 assembly, which is this piece here. So all I did at this point was I took the plate, which I have here. I don't know that I'll need it, but I just marked a center line reference on both sides here. And then I marked that 3/8 dimension from the bottom edge up. So this line is that 3/8 dimension. Now, all I need to do is using the center line that I've drawn on the part. I've also drawn a center line across the spar here, which matches the seam, if you will, where the two spars come together. That's your center line. All I have to do now is put this in place down the center, and then I'll get a mirror, and looking through these two bottom holes here that I just talked about, sighting through those holes, I'll slide this down in place until I can see my 3/8 inch reference line centered on those two holes. So as long as that bottom 3/8 line is centered within these two holes, and my vertical center line lines up with this center line here, this should be positioned in the right location. At that point, I can clamp it in place, and then I can come back with my vertical stabilizer and slip it down over top. All right, so let me get some clamps, and I'll see if I can't get this into position. All right, so looking at drawing 27 alpha, this is the plate that I was just talking about. I noticed another dimension here. This is off of the center line of the spars where they meet on the horizontal stabilizer. The center line of the part itself, the 781, I had already drawn a center line on my part. So from that center line over to the center line of the hole is 1.5 inches. So if you come up from the bottom 3/8 of an inch, you find your center line and come over 1.5 inches, center line, come over 1.5 inches. That's the location for these two holes, which, like I've pointed out, are already pre-drilled on the horizontal stabilizer. So that's what I've done. I've marked those two hole locations. I've got the bracket clamped in place. Unfortunately, you can't see my center line. I didn't extend it onto this part here, so that's no good. But looking through these two holes using a mirror, I can clearly see my hole locations that I had marked on this part. I'd marked two little crosshairs, and I see those crosshairs using a mirror through the hole here and here. And I've also verified from this side you can see my center line mark on the part lines up with the center line that I've extended from the horizontal stabilizer. That crease where the two spars meet, I extended that line out. You can see that my center line here is in line with my center line here. And then to make sure that the bracket itself is square, I just used a square on the deck, because remember this is level. And then I just push it up against the side of the part, the side of the bracket, to set the bracket square in this orientation. So now again, sighting through the holes on the back side of the horizontal, I can see my crosshairs that I marked using the dimensions on the plans. I can see those centered on the holes. And then from this side, I can see that the part is centered on the center line of the fuselage. And using my square, it is square to the deck plate. So I'm going to go ahead and run my drill bit through this back side like I always do and twirl it around to make a mark on the plate. Then I'll take the plate off and I'll drill it only to 1/8 inch. That way I can get a couple clecos in it, top and bottom. I guess I'll go ahead and do all 4. And then I'll bring up the vertical and see what gives. As you can see, I've got the bracket now clecoed in place. I've got the 2 bottom clecos in here. I marked the top 2 holes, but I decided not to drill the holes into the plate just yet. I wanted to, before I totally committed to drilling holes in this thing, I wanted to at least get it secured with 2 and see how everything else starts to fit together. If I need to make an adjustment, I only need to adjust 2 holes rather than screwing around with potentially redoing all 4. So I did mark these 2, I just didn't drill them. These 2 obviously have been drilled and it's clecoed in place. And if you come around here to the back side, you can see there that it's lined up with my black mark. And if I throw a level here up on top, you can see that it's level. So I'm convinced that it is nice and square. It's centered left to right. It's got the correct height vertically this way, as evident by the line that I had drawn across the bottom and then sighted that through the holes. So I'm very happy with that. It's now clecoed in place, so now I can bring up the vertical and start fitting it together. Howdy everyone. You can see that I've got the vertical stabilizer now temporarily clamped in place on the fuselage. So I'll go over a few things here. This, I don't know how well that's going to show up, but here is the plate. I forget the number for this, but this is the plate. It's about 4 inches wide, and it comes down behind this spar. It's this piece comes down behind the back of the spar here. It's pre-bent and it's pre-punched on the top side. This is the plate that I went ahead and match drilled through the front spar as I talked about, and now I've got it clecoed in place. So here's part of the setup. And again, all of this is very critical because it's part of the rigging to get your airplane to fly the way it's supposed to fly. So the rear spar of the vertical stabilizer comes down, and there's a measurement on the plans. You measure off of the top of the longeron, from the top of the longeron down to the top face of the bottom hinge. There's a dimension given, and that sets the height of the rudder, or of the vertical stabilizer. And then you also have to clamp it. The back part has to be clamped securely flat against this rear bulkhead. Once you have that established, then when you come around to this bracket, you may or may not have a gap between the bracket and the front spar of the vertical. The other thing that you need to check is the offset. So there's a notch here on this bulkhead which is center, and I believe this hole here is also center. But if you use this notch as a reference, the center line, if you can imagine a center line down this front edge of the vertical, that center line should be offset to the left of the fuselage center line by 1/4 of an inch. And all of this is talked about in the written instructions. So at this point, I've got my 1/4 inch offset at the front. I've got the vertical clamped in the back. I've got my height from the longeron to the top of to this hinge. I've got that all set. And then you take a measurement from the top of the vertical down to a reference point on the horizontal. You use the same reference points on both sides. And whatever that dimension is, it has to be equal on both sides, and that makes sure that the vertical is in fact vertical. And if you want to get fancy, after you have that set with your tape measure, you can put a digital scale on either side of it. You can put the scale here, and you'll get a number. Put it on the opposite side, you should get the same number. That's another cross check. So now that I have all of that established, you take a straight edge and you lay it on the tip of your hinges. So you run it from the tip of this bottom hinge on up across this hinge and across the top hinge. Now I use a 4-foot steel ruler. When I lay it across the 3 hinges, it pivots ever so slightly off of the middle hinge. So if I lay it on the top hinge, come down and lay it on the middle hinge, it won't touch the bottom hinge. And I'm talking like maybe it's maybe an eighth. I think it's less than an eighth. And if I lay it on the bottom hinge and I lay it on the top hinge, when it comes up to the top, it won't touch. So it pivots here. Now the instructions go through that, and they talk about if you clamp this front piece together, if you clamp the front spar to that plate, and the top hinge somehow gets flexed backward, that's okay. But if it gets pulled forward, then you have to put a shim in there. So there again, if I run my straight edge from the front of this hinge to the front of this hinge and extend it on up, it appears that this hinge is being pulled forward. However, it's a minute amount. I can actually hold the straight edge on both ends and it will touch all 3. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to unclamp it from up here. I'm going to leave everything else like it is clamped, but I'm going to loosen those 4 clamps and see if a gap opens up between the front spar and that mounting plate. I'm assuming it will. If it does, then that's going to allow this hinge to come back a little bit. And at that point, I can almost guarantee that all 3 of these hinges will line up with my straight edge. At that point, they say that you can put a shim in there, a spacer, if you will, to take up that gap between the front spar and this plate. So I'm going to do that. Let me get these clamps off of here, and I'll see if this gap opens up. And if it does, I'll see if my hinges are better aligned and kind of see where it all settles out.